Yes, it is being recorded because there is a lot of detail to get through. And I've sent this pack off to Neil as well. If you want to have this package that I'm presenting today, it will be available after this webinar. There's a lot of detail to get through. It is pretty timely considering how wet we have been. A lot of flooding across Australia at the moment. We've got severe flooding happening through much of New South Wales, my own whole patch where I was doing a lot of the news coverage for, and certainly some significant issues for our farmers. But it's been spread now to domestic and private settings right across the river systems through New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and even out through parts of South Australia, outback South Australia, even northern and eastern Tasmania in the coming days. So let's just move through it now because we have got quite a few slides to get through. I do run now Weather Matters with yours truly, Karl Lijnders. I did step away from TV to do this project. This is my passion project. This is what I was called to do. And if you want more information, you can certainly hit me up at the email at the end of this webinar. So lots to talk about. So the topics I'm covering today, very briefly, we'll do the science behind the weather and the forecasting of weather globally and around Australia. We'll have a look at why the weather is becoming more volatile and why forward information is really crucial. We'll have a look at the severe weather issues right through the next 6 months and into 2023. I'll give you a forward indication of where things are heading and what to look out for. And that will help you inform decisions in your part of the world. It's really critically important. It's being informed to make those decisions ahead of time, not reacting in the moment, but ahead of time. So let's do a very, very quick, brief overview of the drivers, the climate drivers. And you hear a lot about these in the media all the time. I love the terms of rain bombs and ghost storms and all these interesting things. Really, that doesn't actually help inform anybody. So let's talk about the weather, the science behind what's going on right now. The ENSO region, whether it's La Nina or El Nino, we know it's in La Nina. It's in a wet phase. The Indian Ocean, it's in a wet phase. We call that the Indian Ocean dipole. And the southern annular mode on the right-hand side there, that's called the SAM, and that is also in a wet phase. So very quickly, we'll look at the ENSO region first. The current phase we're in at the moment is pushing all the warmer waters towards Australia. That's the La Nina conditions. That's the graphic in the bottom left-hand corner. So we're currently in that phase. The other two graphics, the one in the far right-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner, that's El Nino. We are likely to get back into that probably at the end of next year. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And the normal conditions, what's normal anymore? I feel like we haven't had a normal year for so long across Australia. It's been like one extreme to the other. That particular graphic in the top right-hand corner is actually becoming more of an outlier in terms of what we're seeing climatically across the globe, but the impacts across Australia. So let's just talk about La Nina. We've heard about it in the news. You're pretty much well versed on it now. We've had it for 3 years. It means all those warmer waters are pushed towards Australia. The high impacts from Darwin down through the Stewart Highway to about Tennant Creek. You turn the corner through Camberwell, down through Mount Isa. You draw the line down to East Gippsland. That's where you find anywhere to the east of that line, the heavy impacts. And we've seen that in the past 2 years. Anywhere to the west of that, the further west you go through the country, out towards WA, we've got probably a few people there in Bunbury enjoying the fact that they're not being impacted by La Nina at the moment in terms of rainfall, but you do get hotter temperatures in the west as a result. So elevated fire dangers are a concern. Now, the Indian Ocean dipole, that has been something that's been thrown around in the media of late. We are currently in a negative phase. And that phase is represented by the lower graphic there, the one on the bottom. That's all the warmer water being pushed towards Australia's north and west. And that's what's causing all the flooding at the moment, not the La Nina. So we're seeing impacts of the winter warming of that ocean, and that's spreading right throughout northern and western Australia, coming through into the food bowl. And that's why it's so wet. And as you can see, the higher impacts are actually through southern, western, and southeastern parts of the country, and it grades to a lighter impact as you get through southern Queensland. That area in the high impact zone is going to be hit by some pretty heavy rain tomorrow, and that is a result of the Indian Ocean dipole. So if you check the satellite picture after this today, if you're like a weather weenie like me, you'll see a big cloud band coming across Australia that's coming out of the Indian Ocean. And we don't talk about that much in the media circles because people just glaze over. But in terms of insurance, this particular driver has a lot of impact in terms of hitting heavily populated areas and causing significant flooding, and we are seeing that right now. Back to the globe as such, this is the current sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. Now, I spoke about La Nina before. The blue shading is not what you want to see in terms of wanting a dry, hot summer. We've got a lot of cold water that's upwelling through the central equatorial Pacific, and it pushes all that warmer water from the Pacific in the around the Cook Islands and out to around Easter Island, all the way back towards Australia. And that's why it's so wet across eastern, northern, and southeastern Australia. So the climate is in uncharted waters at the moment. We've got back-to-back negative Indian Ocean dipole events. That's never happened before. The La Nina is back for a third year in a row. That's only the fourth time in about 120 years of record keeping that's ever happened. With a longer stretch of positive SAM phase, that means the winds are coming in off the east coast and presenting lots of rain for eastern Australia. Hence why we're seeing flooding in Lismore. We've heard a lot about Lismore getting flooded, but not just Lismore. The whole east coast has seen record rainfall because of that. The sea surface temperatures around northern and eastern Australia near record levels right now. And that's yet to play out across the country. We've got also global conditions also representing near record conditions. But on the other side of the globe, in Africa at the moment, they've got conditions that are conducive to severe drought, and there's famine ongoing through parts of Somalia and interior parts of Africa, just as a contrast to what's happening here at home. And further around the globe, you can see there's been major flooding in Bangladesh with record flooding. We've had record flash flooding in Seoul. We've had record flash flooding and riverine flooding in Pakistan. But on the other side of the coin, in the US, we've got major drought underway, and there's been food shortages being recorded in parts of not just Africa, but also in Mexico and parts of the Southwest having a poor monsoon. Record heat waves in Europe and the UK, some of the deadliest they've seen in Europe in many hundreds of years. India recording heat waves throughout most of their monsoonal season. That's because the sea surface temperatures are so erratic at the moment. And, you know, climate scientists I've been talking to are really quite confused as to why we're just seeing this persistence, this stubbornness, when we're used to seeing more oscillation between one phase to the other. And that's led to major tornado outbreaks through much of the US. That's not uncommon, but the damage scale has been quite off the charts in recent years. In the last decade, we've seen probably some of the most deadly tornado outbreaks in the US, resulting in billions of dollars worth of insurance claims. In the US, also freeze conditions. And that's also something we've seen across Australia with record-breaking overnight temperatures just in the winter just gone. And back home, we saw that flooding through Lismore March to May. We saw Queensland underwater. Sydney's just broken its record for annual rainfall just in the last week, and we've got 3 months to go. So certainly a lot of weather to get through. And obviously, just in recent times, Hurricane Ian. This is an interesting one for you guys up there in Darwin, particularly the northern tropics, just to be mindful that, yes, we have not had many cyclones go through, but when they've been forming, they have been forming a lot faster, a lot more intensely. And this one over in America, now it's over the other side of the globe, but the idea and the concept's still the same. Systems are developing quicker, more erratically, and they are producing much more violent weather. We saw that just on the news feeds about 2 weeks ago. So back home, we are looking at the sea surface temperatures at the moment. The area that I'm highlighting here, just to the north of Australia, is the dangerous aspect for the coming 3 months. We know the La Nina is in phase. We know the Indian Ocean over here is also in phase, but it's the waters northwest of Australia that are causing significant concern around rainfall, not only in the coming couple of days, but certainly in the next 6 weeks. And this is a rainfall outlook I prepared a week ago. I've updated this this morning for my clients, but it has not much change to this. A 98% chance of rainfall being above average over a large scale area like this, which is basically saturated to the point when it rains, it's like raining on concrete, just washes off and runs off. That is significant, and it's very rare. So again, a lot of people that are living along the Murray, the Murrumbidgee, throughout the Lachlan Shire Valley, you know, through Dubbo, already under floodwaters. It's significant risk. The length of flood warnings, as long as my arm, they're expected to continue. Lots and lots of people under flood warning and under flood watch at the moment, up to 5 million people across the country. A lot of assets under threat in the coming 6 weeks. And I've had a lot of people say to me in recent times, well, this can't happen to me. It can happen to you. And if you're living in regional areas along river systems, get prepared now. It's not about preparing when the rain's coming, it's preparing ahead in advance. And that's why communicating that threat is so critically important. That's the heart of what I do. And I do that for a lot of my farmers, my farming clients, my agriculturalist clients, a range of different event industries, and they live and die by the weather in terms of their bottom line. And they are well versed and prepared for this particular season. So that's why it is so incredibly important to have accurate, up-to-date details, making sure you have many ways of getting warnings, access to relevant and up-to-date information. Now, I draw the risk a very different way, and you'll see all the charts here, a lot of color, a lot of vibrancy. That's to pull you in. That is to grab your attention and go, oh, okay, so what does that mean for my part of the world? And it's about doing it in a way that makes it easy in a time-poor society. Look, we're all busy. I'm busy. We're all busy. We've got multiple warnings that I'm dealing with at the moment. I've got my feeds going off, and people just haven't got the time to go searching for it. So that's why I presented in a really simple, clear way. So as we move into the presentation now for what we can expect in terms of the risks nationally, and just for you guys, if you're there in Tasmania, hello to you. I just haven't put Tasmania on the chart. I'm adding that to the Victorian charts. Your charts are very similar to Victoria at the moment, so I'll explain that your risk as we go through as well. So let's have a look at the flash flood risk for 2022-23. Now, this is for the severe weather season that runs from October through April. So that's the window of severe weather where the weathers are most active across Australia, where we have all the dynamics in play. Let's start out in the north now for Northern Australia. It's really moot point when we talk about flash flooding. It's wet season. We get flash flooding all the time. But this is measuring the risk of flash flooding being above normal. Now, Darwin saw a severe thunderstorm go through on the weekend, producing a wind gust of 140 kilometers an hour. That was the strongest wind gust recorded since Cyclone Tracy. So thunderstorms can pack a punch across the northern tropics and cause damage, and there was damage over parts of the northern suburbs. In terms of rainfall, heaviest right down the guts through the central interior, right through to Alice Springs. So we're looking at a lot of communities from Mataranka down through to Alice Springs being cut off from time to time in points east and west, and also got to watch those cyclone risks. Eastern Australia, very high risk continues right throughout the period. You are looking at significant issues right throughout the coming 6 months, particularly between now and I'd say February, with the conditions easing in the March at this stage. For Eastern Australia, it's a moot point again. Most areas under flood watch at the moment. For Tasmania, northern eastern areas are looking at a very high risk. It does moderate over the western side of the island. In terms of South Australia, the further south and west you go, your risk is lessened because you are on the edge of the worst severe weather aspects. All of that mainly through areas north of Tarcoola and through the outback. So you're looking at a lot of flooding through many populated centres. And looking at South Australia back towards WA, you can see that the further west you go, you're out of that really deep moisture that's coming out of the Indian Ocean as well as the Coral Sea. So WA is the place to be. If you don't want flash flooding, head to the west. It's looking pretty good at this stage. Fairly seasonal for major centres like Perth down to Bunbury, down to Albany at this point in time. The outback areas around Kalgoorlie, throughout the Goldfields, the Wheat Belt, that is areas around Westonia, up towards Kalbarri, even Geraldton. Just watch those storm outbreaks from time to time. We do start to get some pretty lively ones through late November, and that should start to take off as the air becomes hotter. The only thing saving WA at the moment is the fact that things are quite cool, and as the air gets warmer, just keep that in the back of your mind. If you're living in the western parts of the country, the air getting more hot and hotter will lead to severe thunderstorm outbreaks becoming more frequent. Now, riverine flooding is different from flash flooding. Flash flooding is there and it's gone. Riverine flooding is the long, drawn-out flooding in the major river systems. And over the top end, we've got above average rainfall already underway, and that sets the stage for a pretty decent wet, I would think, with the La Nina in place. And I do think we'll see heavier rainfall through November, December, maybe tapering off in January, but picking up in February, March, April. So that's your window for the wettest weather throughout Northern Australia. Cyclones, always change that. And if you're living down the Stuart Highway, that's where you find you may be cut off from time to time. That extends into northern Queensland, obviously down through the tropical Queensland coasts and right down even through Longreach. Really high numbers are expected in terms of rainfall. So a lot of these communities between Mount Isa, Longreach, down into the southeast of Queensland, already under flood watch from time to time. That will increase with the La Nina peaking in the January, and then we'll see that starting to fade in towards autumn of next year. Moot point for much of the southeast. We know it's already flooding, so that will continue right throughout the remainder of the year and probably start to ease in the mid to late January. From about Australia Day onwards, I do think we'll see conditions starting to ease across southeastern part of the country. The ACT has been particularly wet, and that will continue also throughout much of the next 4 months before easing. Sydney, your wet weather will continue right through until about March, April. And Adelaide sits on the worst of it at the moment. We will see the riverine flooding coming from the Murray, extending over Renmark down in towards the mouth of the Murray there in South Australia. And many areas could see that as record flooding between November and January. So just keep an eye on the trends if you are in that region or know anybody in that region. So the further west you head through the nation, it does start to dry out. Your risks are lessened, but that's still pretty elevated for this time of year for the outback, the arid zones of the country. WA, your risks are reduced because we are moving out of the filling season. Your severe weather season is generally running from winter time, so from about May through October. So you're coming into a period where we are looking at more stable weather in terms of the flash and riverine flood risk. Heavier rainfall is expected through the interior, and always watch those cyclones as they come in from March. We'll talk about that in just a moment. In terms of large hail, and this is an interesting one because a lot of areas are starting to become uninsurable in terms of hail. And one of those areas is also through the outback of WA. There's been many hailstorm events through parts of the wheat belt that don't get sort of covered very much because it's a low population area. But I've had a lot of clients reach out to me in the last year and a half, 2 years, suggesting to me that this area that's in the deeper purple is really one of the hotspots for large hail, and crops have been decimated in recent times, a lot of property damage too. So that will also be a feature through the remainder of this severe weather season. We are looking at areas east of Perth, from the Darling Scarp out towards the Wheatbelt Goldfields and the Southwest Land Division, seeing the bulk of the hail risk. That's pretty typical for this part of the world. As you head through South Australia, most of the agricultural areas, are heavier populated centres south of Whyalla, looking okay, but all it takes is one hail event and it's all over for some businesses. So just be mindful that we have got those thunderstorm risks still around seasonal for much of South Australia. It's up to the north and east that you go that you see the deeper purple shading, and that's not something you want to be under, particularly at this time of year, particularly through New South Wales, which is dealing with flooding. As we get the nation warming up, the heat engine starting to warm up across the country, that's when we start to see more buoyancy in the atmosphere, and that supports larger scale thunderstorm outbreaks. And that will start from about mid-November, I do suspect. So if you're living through areas from, say, Cooma through Canberra, right up the Great Dividing Range into southeast Queensland, points west to about Tilpa, Wilcannia, and out to Birdsville and through Queensland, be on alert for large hail between mid-November and all the way through to the end of February. It's going to be pretty active. And like I said, just keep an eye on those temperatures. I know people go, oh, it's just temperatures. If you're getting into the 30-degree mark and above, and you start to get thunderstorms forecast in your region, hail is a likely chance, particularly when you get severe thunderstorms being forecast by the Bureau. Back through the central interior, Alice Springs also gets thunderstorms that produce a lot of hail, particularly around Ayers Rock, Yulara, through the Finke Desert, down through towards Marla, Oodnadatta and Ullamballa. These areas are very low population centres, but if you've got logistics and transport, they can certainly wipe out a fairly big convoy. I've had a lot of logistics clients reach out to me in recent times saying they've been hit pretty hard by hail. That's been unexpected. Damaging winds, and we've certainly seen a lot of that in recent years, and black shading. Very hard to see on this particular chart, but if you're in black, you've got a very high risk of damaging wind events throughout the coming 6 months. And we know that Queensland can cop some absolute whoppers, and we've seen that in recent years. Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia also looking at severe weather events, particularly with thunderstorm outbreaks producing damaging winds. That'll be mainly through areas, I'd say through the desert country to start with, but through January, February, through Victoria, through South Australia, the severe weather risk related to damaging winds, falling trees, because the ground is so saturated, is going to be a huge risk to a lot of property. So if you've got big trees around your property at the moment and all that rainfall across southeastern Australia, keep that in the back of your mind. You may want to start getting an arborist to start chopping some limbs off some heavier trees with all that growth coming out at the moment. Through South Australia, and I'm sorry, for Tasmania as well. No hail risk for Tasmania really of note. In terms of damaging winds, very similar to Victoria. Your damaging wind risk comes in January, February. And for South Australia now, we've got the risk probably, I'd say, through the desert country from now through to about April. The coastal areas from about Euclid down through to Adelaide, as I mentioned, from about January, February, as we start to see a more traditional weather setup develop as the La Nina wanes. And in the west, low risks for WA. Just keep an eye on those heat troughs as they come down from the north, particularly between Carnarvon through Geraldton, down through Perth and Bunbury. Those areas certainly can pick up on the odd storm. Most of the severe weather is usually in the east of the state, which is very typical for this time of year. And up through the north, it's build-up season. As mentioned, we've seen already wind gusts of 140 kilometres an hour through some parts of the northern areas of Darwin in the last weekend. So that's very typical for this time of year, given those high wind events. Now, in terms of heat waves, now, a lot of people think that heat waves don't cause a lot of issues. Well, they do cause a lot of issues to infrastructure, including roads and rails, and be able to connect with community to community. At this stage, the highest risks of heat waves are likely in the west of the nation, And that is because of the persistence of that La Nina. Now, remember, La Nina means a lot of easterly winds. We just showed you the graphic before. And when those winds run over the nation, they dry out and they become hotter. And by the time they reach South Australia, they're warming up. And by the time they get into the southwest of the country, they are hot. And Perth can usually bake, and those areas along the west coast from Exmouth southwards to about, I'd say, around Augusta down there in the southwest Capes there, can bake in the 40s for weeks at a time. It is possible we'll see that this year, probably one event, probably this summer coming up. It is more likely that we'll see a reduced risk of serious heat waves across the west of the country as per normal. But just keep an eye on those temperatures, particularly if we see prolonged easterly winds. In around South Australia, your temperatures start to rise in January, February, and that spreads into Victoria, Western New South Wales, Southwest NT as we go through the end of summer. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about summer being cool and wet. Devil's in the detail. It will start out wet. It will likely get dry from the west of the country. And by the end of summer, there could be some pretty hot days down through Victoria and South Australia with a lot of pressure on the infrastructure through the region. So just keep an eye on that trend. In terms of bushfires, very quickly, it's going to be pretty wet and humid through most of the next 4 months. That just sort of suppresses things. And that's very typical for a La Nina outbreak in terms of the east of the nation seeing a reduced risk. May see a little bit of an elevated risk around the Adelaide Hills, particularly as we get through February, but the higher risk is in that southwestern corner. There is a 60% chance of above average fire dangers with the easterly winds and the drying out of the land mass. So that's very typical for this time of year. And the areas of risk also extend through the Southwest Land Division. Very quickly, as you look at the cyclone season for those up in the north, and these systems, and I spoke about this on Sunrise on Sunday when I did my cross about cyclone season. The interesting part about cyclone season is that people just think it's contained to the northern tropics. Well, we saw years ago that, a couple of years ago, that one came down through, it was called Cyclone Seroja, and I think people in the west of the nation who are with us today can remember that one. It came through Kalbarri and down as far as Geraldton and Northampton, and caused all sorts of problems, a Category 3 storm, and it brought wind gusts of 170 kilometres an hour. And obviously, there's not the infrastructure to deal with those winds. So at this stage, a lot of the cyclones early on in the season will be up over those northern waters. Not all of them will be able to make landfall. It's the systems that come through from about February, March, and April that WA needs to watch out for. And that is areas including as far south as Perth. Believe it or not, that's just how it works in the world of weather. So just be weather aware. It is above average season that has been forecast. That is because we've got warmer waters. We are seeing that the warmer waters are in place over northwestern Australia and over in the northeast of the country as well. And you can see that here in the Timor Sea, north of Darwin, around 2, maybe 3 systems floating about. A lot of these sort of develop north of the Northern Territory and do the hokey pokey and dance around out there and don't do a whole lot of issues. They sort of go out towards WA. But we saw a couple of years ago with Cyclone Lam that sat there north of Elcho Island, and it ripped every tree branch off every tree you could find, and it just sat there for 3 days. So you're just going to be weather aware this time of year, and the cyclone season will probably start probably at 3 weeks earlier than normal. I'm suggesting we could have some named systems on the board floating around northern Australia by the time we get to mid-November. So if you're living in that northern area of Australia, just be weather aware, particularly for flooding and damaging winds early on in the season. Gulf of Carpentaria also looking at above average. The Coral Sea, there's a lot of chitter chatter about, we could be seeing another Cyclone Yasi. Well, we say that every year. I think we love to get those media bites to get people's attention. But in reality, it's possible any year. Cyclone season should be taken seriously. So if you're living in North Queensland, right down towards even as far south as about Port Macquarie, be on alert for cyclones this year because the waters are very warm. And where they travel, it can flood the inland. It can flood a lot of inland Australia and cause all sorts of problems. And we know the nation is very wet already. So we've got multiple issues on the board related to the wet season up north playing an impact further south. But in terms of above average cyclones, yeah, probably an 80% chance of seeing more cyclones than not across northern Australia. So let's do a very quick wrap of the weather for state by state. And again, you can catch all these on the recording after this as well and in the pack that's sent out to you. So for New South Wales, it's a very high risk of every element through the coming 6 months. That's severe storms, large hail. The flooding will continue right through to early next year. The damaging wind threat and the damage to property. There already is damage happening through parts of New South Wales. It is a shot across the bow to everybody that is living along a river system to be weather aware and understand that because it is not happening to you at the moment doesn't mean it will not happen to you. So get prepared, be informed, make appropriate decisions to the weather that is going on. Forecast confidence relatively high in all areas. Large hail is always a bit trickier to predict ahead of time, but certainly elevated at this point in time. For Victoria, very high risk of severe storms and flood issues continuing. It's a high risk for damaging winds and damage to property. The forecast confidence overall is medium to high, and the very high risk, obviously, with that flooding because it's happening at the moment. For South Australia, I think the biggest issue, if you're living anywhere around Adelaide or Point East in the Riverlands, the Murraylands, and in the upper southeast districts, keep an eye on the floodwaters coming out of New South Wales. We'll have extensive flooding running through the Murray River. Starting pretty much from tomorrow, there will be another flood peak developing as a result of 100 millimetres of rain in 2 days. So keep an eye on that, because we could see some flooding exceed the 1970 levels, which saw many areas of Loxton, Renmark, and areas down through that part of the world underwater for months. So certainly some issues there. Otherwise, it's a lot tapering off in terms of the other elements being of high concern, but certainly it's going to be pretty active couple of months for South Australia. For WA, certainly looking at seasonal conditions, large hail is always a very low risk for highly populated centres along the west coast, but interior parts could see certainly some hail risks over coming 2 to 3 months. Severe storms also a high risk over the interior, and it's pretty much a low risk to damage to property, excuse me, as we track through the next 6 months. But also always be weather aware with the forecast of storms in your region. Tropical Australia, this is Northern Australia from the Kimberleys through the top end through towards the Coral Sea. Looking at a high chance of severe storms. We've seen that already. Cyclone activity higher than normal chance across the coming 6 months. The flood issues are very, very high right across the countries, north and east, and that's no surprise for the north of the country as well. Damage to property, medium chance, with a high confidence of more cyclones about. That could cause some issues related to property damage, but it's fairly good coding through parts of the north of the nation. And for Queensland, well, all the issues are off the charts at the moment. We are certainly looking at a lot of severe storm activity right across northern Australia, including a lot of Queensland, inland Queensland, coastal Queensland. Just be weather aware, very tricky 4 months coming up, I do suspect, maybe easing by the February, March. But at this stage, it is just a tough time for many people in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. And very quickly moving into 2023, going back to the charts, and this is the extended outlook for the ENSO. We're going back to the Pacific Ocean. We're talking about the drivers again. And we can see we're in La Nina at the moment, likely to see that end, and we're likely then to move possibly into an El Nino phase by the time we get to 2024. And that is also coupled with the Indian Ocean coming out of its wet phase through the coming months and then going into a neutral phase throughout most of summer. And then we're looking at dry conditions developing from the northwest of the country next year. So we're looking at a different year next year. A lot of people saying, are we going to have more rainfall? Are we going to have more flooding? Probably not. I would think we're leaning more towards a drier phase, but there is the risk of some droughts developing probably the end of next year, if not the talk of it developing into 2024. And there's the flip. There's no normal years anymore. We're certainly going from one extreme to the other. So then when we get to that period of drying out, all this rainfall, then bushfires start to become the topic of discussion, and water conservation. And we talk about, all the risks to infrastructures, the temperatures start to rise and how that impacts your community. So that will be the flip of the coin in 12 months' time. I do suspect when we're starting to come out of the floods, our minds will turn back towards looking at what droughts again across the country. So that's it for now, Neil. I'll hand it back to you because I think I've raced through it as quick as I can. So I'll hand it back to you at the moment.
Wow, you can sure talk, Karl.
Get the video.
Take a breath, mate. Breathe.
All good. I'm used to it.
That was very interesting. I was writing notes and thank you for that. So please, if anyone does have a question, you can whack it in the chat or maybe just pop your hand up and feel free to ask. But I do have a couple of questions. I'm just, let's start at the very end. At the very end there, you've sort of crystal balled, the fact that the next sort of 12 months is we're looking at the kind of wet, sort of severe wind conditions, wet, that kind of stuff. And then beyond that, then you're looking at potentially it all drying up and going into the opposite phase. Is that kind of a normal cycle?
It is, and it should, Neil, it should happen that way because we've been in a wet phase for now 3 years across the country. Now, a lot of chitter chatter last year was saying that this year was going to be the dry year. And I was forecasting with my clients saying, no, let's just everyone take a breath and have a cup of tea and lie down, because things don't, we put things in with a natural science into a human-induced box, and it doesn't work like that. But under your question, to answer your question, yes, and now looking at the data sets that have been presented before us, it'll be remiss of me not to say that we are moving into a dry phase next year with less severe weather based upon rainfall and severe thunderstorm outbreaks. We're probably going to tend to more of a drier phase, which also poses its own threats of bushfires, as I mentioned. We turn towards water conservation, thinking about how we're handling all that excess water now. Do we need to get more tanks on our property so we're more drought resilient? So we talk drought resilience. I mean, I talked about flood resilience for many years. Now I'm talking about drought resilience now with my clients. So that's certainly a very plausible idea, and I do think will likely dry out.
Yeah, so that's really good. So from a weather risk point of view, you really don't get much of a break, do you? I mean, you've got to really sort of, particularly with, like I say, looking down the list of people here, we've got, like I say, we've got Geraldton, we've got, Sale, we've got Tassie, we've got people from everywhere around Australia, and people's weather risk will be different depending on where they are located. And it's really good, kind of the way you've broken it down into hail, damaging winds. Your comment on if you've got severe winds and with lots of trees and wet ground, and trees go over easier. Consider getting your arborists in. So there's a lot of things to consider with our property and maintenance and prevention. One of the things I can say though is, so some of and this is a bit of a hot off the press for everyone here on this webinar today. Our preliminary terms have started coming in for our property program, and what I can tell you is that the insurer has done a geocoded analysis of every single property in our folio. So they and now they, for example, one diocese, they have listed 6 specific properties that they're going to limit cover on because of 1 in 80-year flood risk. So we're getting now to the stage where in our folio, the insurer is looking at every single property, where it's located, and the risks that are associated with that. We're also potentially looking at now, insurers could, as you've mentioned, Karl, potentially even go look at zones for storms, for hail risk, etc., etc. So the advancements in weather and weather predicting are also seen in the insurance sector with their intelligence and the way they approach things. I'm interested though, Karl, and we will wrap up in a moment. Is there any other questions before? Any other questions? Anyone want to put their hand up? I've got nobody at this point. Cool. Yeah, I'm interested to know over the next sort of okay, so when you look at the floods, even in New South Wales, which we know is the second biggest insurable loss event in the history of Australia, so that it's a massive thing. One of the things that they've noticed is that you kind of have the prolonged, so you get really soaked land, then it doesn't take much to reflood. I'm interested in your observations and thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really great topic because it's happening right now. I mean, in New South Wales alone, and particularly around the ACT where I am, I'm in Canberra at the moment. It's a great example. And the Queanbeyan River has not flooded in about, let's say, 20 years really decently. And we just have had non-stop rainfall here. We get maybe a day of sunshine like we've got today, but there's not enough time to dry out. And you're going to start to see that impacting larger populous centres like Melbourne and even possibly Adelaide in the coming weeks ahead. What we're seeing is that the ground just cannot take any more water. It's like concrete. Everything is like concrete out there. So if you're watching rain hit concrete, it just washes off. That's what's happening on the loam soil, the hard packed soil. It's happening on every soil type in the east of the country. And so what's happening is that we just have not got enough drier weather that's been forecast because the climate drivers in the phases that they are so stubbornly set to wet just won't allow us to get into a dry pattern. So we are looking at more flooding developing over the coming days. But what that's going to do is possibly even eclipse the bigger flood. You stated, I think it was the second, was it the second largest?
Insurable loss, yeah.
I think we can probably eclipse that, not being, alarmist, but I would not be surprised by the time we get to probably January next year that we'll probably eclipse that, because it's covering a greater area now, heavily populated centres up and down the eastern seaboard. What this is doing, it's now ripping out the crops. My farmers are saying, Dubbo, we're done. Carl, you had it right. We insured our crops. Like, I have people saying to me, what level of insurance should I take out? Now, I never advise people what that is, but I give them the information like I've given you all this afternoon. And I inform them and say, well, this is what the parameters are. This is the boom. This is the bust. And this is the mean. This is the middle of where we are. This is the zone where I think the weather's going to plow through. And that's what I've just showed you all before in very, very quick graphical terms. And people make appropriate decisions to them. And in terms of flooding, Neil, as you just alluding to before, my clients were able to make decisions 8 months ago because I predicted all this weather, not perfectly, because you never predict weather perfectly. It's a natural science. So you're never perfect, but I got close enough to the post for enough people to go, you know what, you got us right. We're actually okay. We actually insured everything enough in the agricultural sector that I deal with primarily. So that for me gave me feedback, and being able to do this for you today also just sort of gets you to think about things a little bit more, in an agile manner, because weather is agile. So in terms of flooding, if you're living in a river, along a river system, you got to think not only about flooding, but like you said, soggy trees, soggy soils with those root systems that are all lifting up to the surface because they're just like, we can't take any more water, and they all topple over. That's happening here in the ACT without any wind. So you can't imagine what's going to happen if you had a Melbourne windstorm like last year come through. Mate, I tell you what, it'd be absolute disaster from, roofs being taken out.
Yeah. So I guess, and that then comes down to, I guess, risk management 101, isn't it? It's about understanding what our risks are, and then what are the things that we can do to mitigate for those risks. And like I say, you're presenting us with the data, and that's the challenge for everyone who's on this webinar today and who'll watch it on video later as well, is to be intentional about the way we approach this and to understand, hey, this is a real thing. We talk about, people complain about their insurance costs rising. Well, here we are. I'm telling you exactly why. And like I say, we've got Karl with us, who's telling us, look, this is not going to let up. And we're going to go through these big up and downs and cycles. And so what we've got to do is just be intentional about the way we look at these risks, assess them, and potentially manage them. All right. Is there any questions before we kind of going to wrap up here? Any questions?
I think I've just stunned them all into submission.
Yeah. So I apologize. Karl did move very quickly through. He said a lot of stuff on all the different types of risks. So I will put this up. You can see I've recorded it. I will put this up on YouTube. I'll send the link out, and Karl's also given me permission to distribute his report. One of the other things is, if you do want to keep, if you do want further specific information about your region and the forecasts, obviously, weathermatters.org, go and contact Karl there. I think it's a subscription, but it's a pretty cheap subscription too, I think, Karl. I think
it is. It is. It's one of the cheapest in the country. And that's because it has to be accessible to everybody in the good times and the bad. And that's particularly for the farmers who go through boom and bust cycles. And, I could charge 10 times what I do, but it's not about that. It's about making sure people have access to information that supplements what the Bureau provides everybody freely. We all pay for that out of our taxes. But what I do is I provide meat on the bones, as you just saw, and give you the breakdown of what you need to know ahead of time. So that's what I do. That's the heart of what I do. And make sure before we go, Neil, that you have multiple ways to receive warnings. There is no excuse to be out in floodwaters. This is a dangerous time right across Eastern and Northern Australia. If you've got clients, if you've got family members, this is my heart cry. Make sure that you are safe and away from floodwaters, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales in the coming days. It's going to be pretty wild, Neil.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karl. Really appreciate that. We're gonna finish off there, and thank you. Yeah, really appreciate your time, Karl. Thank you for everyone for attending, and we'll no doubt be in contact in the next week or so regarding the renewal progress. But yeah, bless you guys and have a great day.